to our third lecture on labor supply. For this lecture, it's important to review again the income and substitution effects. The income effect, again, is defined as the change in hours worked with respect to a change in income, holding wages constant. And we believe that this ratio is less than zero. So when you have a positive increase in income, hours worked falls. And that's because we assumed that leisure was a normal good, and we would consume more of it if we had more income. The substitution effect is the change in hours worked with respect to the change in wage, holding income constant. And we believe that that relationship is greater than zero. So our income leisure choice model is very useful in analyzing the incentive effects of various income maintenance programs. Income maintenance programs are simply government programs that are aimed to increase the incomes of certain people in need. We're only going to be considering partial equilibrium effects, so we're not going to be looking at dynamic changes over time. Or, for example, we're just going to look at the partial equilibrium effects of these types of programs. You can think that perhaps some of these programs could change the overall labor supply in the market, and that would affect the wage. We're not going to go there. We're just going to focus on the immediate effects of the programs. So looking ahead, we're going to see that our labor-leisure model will suggest that things like cash grants will reduce incentives to work. So welfare programs will create work disincentives. And we'll also see that welfare will reduce the supply of labor by increasing non-labor income, which also raises the reservation wage. So the first income maintenance program we're going to look at is called a demo grant, which is simply a cash grant, but it's based on certain demographic characteristics, such as age or sex. It's essentially a lump sum transfer, so it's just money provided to the individual from the government. They don't have to work for it. Many of these are universal, so for example, old age security. So anyone over the age of 65, they get a certain payment per month, and that's all that it takes for them to qualify for this payment. Another example is the Universal Child Care Benefit in Canada. In this program, individuals are given a monthly payment of $160 for children under 6 and $60 for children aged 6 to 7. And that's only conditional on the age and number of children here. It doesn't matter about their income, and they're just given that money as a cash grant. So now let's see what our model would say about such a scheme. So here we have our individual. They're optimizing at point E0. Their income is Y0. Now let's add a demo grant. So this individual, we're going to say, qualifies for a certain amount of income represented by the vertical distance here, and they're going to get that money unconditionally. So what does that do to their budget constraint? Well, it shifts it upwards, right? So if they don't work and so their total discretionary time is all being used for leisure, they're going to get this amount of money. YD, we're going to call it. D for demo grant. Okay, so this is going to be their non-labor income. Now, if they decide to work, they're going to get paid their regular wage, and their income will increase accordingly. And they'll be anywhere on this budget constraint. So, for example, if the person were to work the exact same amount, or take the same amount of leisure in the face of this demo grant, they would be at this indifference curve, U0, and they would be at E1. But we know that the person would not be maximizing their utility. To maximize their utility, they would go to a point such as ED, where they're getting higher utility. And what's important is clearly the worker will get higher utility from working less in the face of a demo grant. So here, with a demo grant, work incentives are unambiguously reduced. There's no substitution effect, only a pure income effect. And we know the income effect works to reduce the amount of labor hours supplied. We assumed leisure was a normal good. Now let's look at another example. Here, this is a take it or leave it cash grant of $500 per week. Okay, and we're going to start with a worker who's optimizing at point P. Now let's suppose they qualify for this $500 per week grant. Okay, if they decide not to work at all, they would be at indifference curve U1. So actually, in this example, given this person's preferences, clearly here we see that in the face of this program, the person would now decide not to work at all. If you look here, if their income is 500, so this is their non-labor income that they're going to get from the cash grant, and you think about the highest indifference curve, it's going to be tangent here at G. Clearly then, the worker will decide not to work. They would get higher utility from not working. So they'll have no work, all leisure. So overall, a lump sum demo grant, or just in general a cash grant, results in no substitution effect, and that's because the wage is not changing. The work incentives are unambiguously reduced, and there's only a pure leisure-inducing income effect. So the increase in income is less than the amount of the demo grant, or a portion of the demo grant is used to buy leisure. So what this is saying is that in the face of a demo grant or cash grant, some of that increase in income is going to be used to buy leisure. Now let's look at a traditional welfare program. Traditional welfare programs have 100% clawback. So what that means is that if you're getting a welfare payment from the government and you decide to, say, work on the side and make an extra $100, well, if that's the case, your welfare will be reduced by that exact same amount, that $100. So 100% will be clawed back or taken back by the government. So right here, we're looking at the situation without the traditional welfare. The wage for this person is $10. And so if they work 16 hours a day, they're going to make $160. Now suppose they're eligible for a welfare benefit of this amount. Okay? If they decide, for example, to work 2 hours, so they're going to take 2 hours less of leisure, then they're going to be taking home exactly the same amount. So if they're here and they don't work, they're going to get $100. So in this example, again, the welfare benefit is $100. So if they don't work, they're going to get $100. But if they do work, they're going to make $20 in income, 2 hours times the wage. But their welfare payment is going to be reduced by that exact same amount, and so they're going to receive $80. And so their total income is $100. So for any points here, so any positive amount of work up to here, their income stays the same. And so the budget line is going to look like this. It's going to be completely horizontal here because additional work provides no increase in their income, because whatever they make, it's taken back by the government from their welfare benefit. So they're always going to make $100. If they decide to work more than this amount here, so say somewhere over here, then in that case they won't be eligible for the welfare benefit, and they'll make whatever they make in the labor market. In this example, this point is 10. So if they work, if they give up more leisure than 10 hours, they're fine, they're not going to qualify for that welfare benefit. So let's do an example with an individual who has these types of preferences. So they're going to maximize here at point E0. Here's our welfare benefit. We know in the face of this welfare benefit, the income constraint, potential income constraint, or budget constraint is going to look like this. Now, what would we expect to see in terms of the incentives on work? Well, before the welfare benefit, the person is here at E0, but now in the face of this new budget constraint, are they still optimizing their utility? Well, no, because look, if you bring this indifference curve out more, we can see that they would get higher utility now if they just didn't work. So in this case, they're going to make a little bit less money, but they don't have to work. And so they're getting a lot of extra utility from taking that extra leisure. Okay, so in many cases, and in the traditional welfare programs, provide a strong incentive for individuals to move to a corner solution and not work at all. Because if they work, the money is clawed back by the government. So there's no point in working here. If individuals work in this range here, they're going to be getting less utility because they're giving up leisure that's going to provide disutility, but they're getting the same amount of income. And remember, people get, in our model, utility from income and leisure. When you're moving along here, your income is constant, but your leisure is falling. So there's no point in working here. So in this case, in this example, the individual would just decide not to work in the face of this welfare benefit. Someone who has very very flat indifference curves may decide to work over here and it won't affect them, but many people it would. So that example we just looked at is an example of a more general idea of programs that have net wage rates of 0. Program benefits are paid based on the difference between one's actual earnings and one's actual needs in these types of programs. So the payment of benefits is based on the difference between actual earnings and needs, creates a net wage of 0. In our example here, we see that here YN is what maybe the government determines as the minimum income a household should have. Okay? And if their income is below that, they're going to be topped up with the difference. Okay? So in that case, their income is always going to be YN, no matter how much they work in this range. Okay? And that's exactly what was happening in the previous slide. And so here, clearly the income doesn't change, so you're working and you're not getting any increase in your income. So it's a 0 wage. So again, these types of programs have a strong incentive for workers to not work and take more leisure. Now let's talk about a negative income tax. Okay, so this is an income guarantee, so maybe something like a welfare benefit, but with an implicit tax rate of less than 100%. In the previous slide, the tax rate was 100%. But now what happens in a program where not all of the income someone earns is clawed back by the government? Okay, so why do we call it a negative income tax? It's because overall, the recipients will still receive more money from the government than they'll pay out in taxes. So some examples in Canada are the child tax credit, guaranteed income supplement for seniors. So if we think about our formula for our income, here it's Y equals G. So in this case, G is going to be a cash grant. It's going to be the non-labor income you're going to get from the program. And then you're going to be adding 1 minus the tax rate times E, which is your earnings. Okay, so in the last example, this was 100%, so your income was always just equal to the amount of money that was provided by the government. Okay, but here, this is going to be less than 1, and so there's still some positive increase in earnings from working. but overall, you're still getting more from the government. So let's look at an illustration of such a program. So here is our standard budget line. And in this case, the person faces a wage W. There's no non-labor income. They would typically decide to work this amount or take this much leisure at point E0. Now let's suppose there's a grant from the government. We can also call that an income guarantee. This is going to be represented by a shift in the income constraint, but it's not going to be a parallel shift. Because if the person decides to work under this type of program, they're not going to get 100% clawed back from the government. It's going to be less than 100%. So they're going to be able to keep some of their income. So the slope of this, it's not equal to the wage, but it's equal to a fraction of the wage, because they are going to have to give some back to the government. Okay, so here we have the amount of the guaranteed income. If the person doesn't work, they get that amount G. If they decide to work, their income will increase according to this. Wage times 1 minus the tax rate. Okay, and this becomes tangent over here when it wouldn't matter if they were in the program or not. And so if they had preferences such that they were, it could be someone who doesn't like leisure very much at all, they would decide maybe to work here, and so the program wouldn't be relevant to them. But for people with steeper indifference curves, they more than likely will get affected by this program. So in the face of this new budget constraint, what would this individual do? Well, clearly they would move to a point that maximizes their utility here at EN, and it is going to be in the direction that reduces work effort. Okay, so the new equilibrium will unambiguously lie to the right. And that's because both the income and substitution effects work in the same direction to reduce work effort. Let's just think about this. So we can clearly see that there's an income effect. Okay, so remember, the income effect holds the wage constant. Okay, so if we were to take away this person's income until they were tangent at this indifference curve before, we would see that the substitution effect would clearly reduce hours worked, and also the income effect is going from this distance from here to here, and that's also going to reduce work effort. Now, another way to think about this is that we know the income effect is going to reduce hours worked. Okay, so clearly there's an income effect here because they're getting a cash grant. Okay, so there's an income effect that's going to make the person work less. What's the question though is whether or not the substitution effect is going to make them work more or less. Well, what's happening to the wage under this program? Without the program, the wage was W. With the program, the wage is a fraction of W. So the wage is less in the face of the program. And so we know a reduction in the wage rate, holding income constant, will reduce hours worked. So both the income effect and the substitution effect are working in the same direction. So this program will also unambiguously reduce work effort or hours worked. The effect could be smaller though than the traditional welfare program, and so it could in some cases be an improvement, but it still unambiguously reduces work effort. So here's another example. We have an individual who is optimizing at point P and deciding to take 70 hours of leisure. That's in the absence of a welfare program. Now suppose there's a welfare program that gives a cash grant of $500. Okay, so now this person can get a non-labor income of $500, sorry. So $500 is non-labor income. So if they decide to take all of their discretionary time in the form of leisure, they're going to get $500. If they start to work, their income is going to increase by this line. And this line, the slope of it, is half of the slope of the original budget constraint. And that's because they're going to have to give 50% of any income they make back to the government. Okay? And so in this example, the person would optimize at point R. And we already know that this is going to be to the right of the original point, because both the income and substitution effect are going to reduce hours worked. But perhaps it will be much less than a traditional welfare program. In a traditional welfare program, in this example, we could clearly see if this was just a flat line, like the traditional welfare program where it was 100% clawback, then the indifference curve would be maximized here at point G, and the person would decide not to work at all. But at least with this program, the person is working at least some positive hours. And again, how do we decompose the total effect into the income and substitution effect? Well, for the substitution effect, we can just take the old wage, shift it till it gets tangent to the new indifference curve. So here we are holding income constant, but we are looking at just the effects of a difference in wage. So from Q to R, that's the substitution effect. And now the income effect is just from the change in hours of leisure from P to Q. Okay, now let's look at another program that could increase the incomes of low-wage individuals. So what are the effects of a wage subsidy? So a wage subsidy is when the government gives an employee or a worker a subsidy based on how many hours they work. So if their wage is, say, $10, the government may give them an extra $2 for every hour they work. So their wage would be effectively $12, not just $10. So with a wage subsidy, we're just saying that we're going to have our budget constraint rotate to the right. Okay, so a wage subsidy is going to increase the wage. And we already know that that's going to rotate the budget constraint to the right. Okay, so how is that going to affect work incentives? Well, in this example, the person would decide to work less, right? Because their leisure is going to increase. So in this case, we have that the income effect would dominate the substitution effect. So if you remember, when you have a wage change, there's two effects, substitution effect and income effect. And we know that they work in the opposite directions. The income effect makes us want to work less, and the substitution effect makes us want to work more if there's a wage increase, and the other way around if there's a wage decrease. Okay, so in this example, the substitution effect dominates. If it didn't dominate in in this case, the income effect dominated. If the substitution effect dominated, this person would have worked more, and the point here would be to the left of E0. Okay, now it depends on, so this might be a better policy to increase hours worked compared to the negative income tax, depending on what the preferences are of individuals. But it's more likely when we're talking about low income individuals, the substitution effect would likely dominate the income effect because they're at very low levels of income, and so the marginal utility of income is going to be very high, and not so high in terms of leisure, because they already have a fair amount of leisure. Well, if they're not working at all, they would have a very high or very low marginal utility of leisure. Okay, so let's look at a summary. So overall, in terms of wage subsidy, you can't say for sure, because as we discussed, the income and substitution effects work in opposite directions. Okay, it depends on which one dominates. However, the adverse effects of a wage subsidy are likely to be not as great as those of a negative income tax, because likely at low incomes, the substitution effect would dominate. And a disadvantage of a wage subsidy is that it does nothing for income of those who are unable to work. So it would depend on what the objectives of the program is. In this case, if the objectives of the program is to entice people to join the labor market and work more, well, then this isn't going to do all that much for them, because people who are not working, they're not getting a wage. Okay, now we're going to move on to an interesting income maintenance scheme that is a hybrid of the negative income tax and wage subsidy. Okay, it's I guess a relatively new type of program, and it's used in the US. It was used in the US first, and there's also some programs in Canada that are based off of this. What it is, it's a refundable tax credit or subsidy that is paid irrespective of other income taxes paid by the individual. In the US, families who received roughly $60,000 in 2019 would qualify. In Canada, this program is actually named the Federal Working Income Tax Benefit. So let's look at how this works. So there's two phases to this EITC program. There's a phase-in period, which is just a wage subsidy program, okay? And here we think that the substitution effect would generally dominate, but still it's not 100%. It depends on the person's preferences. But we know with a wage subsidy or a wage increase, the substitution and income effects work in opposite directions. But again, likely it will be that the substitution effect will dominate for many people. Now there's a phase out period. Okay, so the phase in period, you're given money, you're getting a wage subsidy, but the phase out period is like our negative income tax, where the government is clawing back some of this money that they're giving out. And in this range, the substitution effect and income effect will work in the same direction, and it will reduce the incentive to work. However, many believe that compared to a traditional welfare program, the EITC results in more incentives to work. And importantly, it also provides incentives on the margin. So what we mean by that is it provides incentives for people who are not working to actually begin working and join the labor market. And that's called the extensive margin. So when you have a wage subsidy, if you think of our reservation wage concept that we learned last lecture, we're basically saying here, well, we have a wage subsidy that's going to increase our the slope of our budget line. And so for many people, it will increase and go beyond the threshold of the reservation wage and entice people to work. So this is an example of how the budget constraint looks in the face of the EITC program. So the line here underneath, so E to F, is the budget constraint of a person not facing this program, or if there was, that wouldn't, before this program would be available. And then we have the EITC budget constraint for someone who's eligible. So let's go over each of these areas. So at point E, the person wouldn't be working. Okay, so their leisure hours are 110. If they decide to work positive hours, they're going to get their wage, but also the government is going to give them 40% more. Okay, so they're going to top up their wage. So this is a wage subsidy. by 40%. So the slope of this line here is W, right? Negative W. And so the slope of this line is negative 1.4 times W, right? Because it's 40% higher, okay? Now, if you work up to the number of hours consistent with point J, so if you work up to 15,400, in other words, if you work at your normal wage, when you get to an amount of 11,000, and in that case, you would actually be getting a total of 15,400, okay, because this is 40% higher than this. You max out, okay, so that's the maximum benefit. Okay, so the maximum benefit is the difference between this, 15,400 and 11,000, okay? Now you get to keep that maximum benefit if you work more. So if you work more in between H and J here, they don't claw back anything. So you get to just, you don't get the subsidy anymore, but you get your standard wage that you get. So that's why these two lines are parallel. Okay, so the net wage would equal the actual wage. Now at point H, this is where the negative income tax comes in, and the government starts taking back a bit of the benefit. So in between H and G, the government's going to take back some of the, so basically it's going to take back 21.06%. So the net wage here is, 21.06% below the actual wage. And this is the negative income tax. And at point G, this is where you would end up breaking even, okay? So basically, if you're at point G, it wouldn't matter if you're in the program or not, you would get the exact same amount of income. Because at this point, they would have clawed back all of any of the benefits that you would get from the program. And then G to F is just your normal standard wage. So it depends on your preferences. Someone with extremely flat indifference curves might maximize here and the program would be irrelevant for them. Many people might have steep indifference curves, and so they would typically maybe maximize down here. And so you can see there's going to be some effect of this new budget constraint on their choice to work. Another illustration, so just a general illustration, the overall pattern of the earned income tax credit is you have a phase-in period, which is the wage subsidy, and a phase-out period. Many of the times, though, after we get to point B, you get to keep the credit for a certain number of hours additional, so for a certain amount of additional hours work, but then the phase-out period starts eventually. In this case, there's just immediately after you reach the maximum, they start clawing it back. So let's think about our incentives to work at these different areas. So between C and B, which is the phase-in period, we have a standard wage subsidy. And we know with a standard wage subsidy that it's indeterminate. It depends on whether the substitution effect dominates the income effect. But we're at low incomes. We're likely on the upward sloping portion of the labor supply curve. So likely this would increase work effort. Okay. The maximum point is B. Okay, so this is the maximum benefit, and then they're starting to take back some of the income, the government is. Okay, and we know here that a negative income tax, the substitution and income effect work in the same direction. So in this case, in the face of this program, there's definitely more income. So we're going to have, in terms of the income effect, a reduction in hours worked. And then also, in the face of the program in this range, the wage is less than the regular wage. So the substitution effect would also reduce hours worked. Okay, so in this case here, unambiguously the amount of work would be reduced. Here's another example. So this is the EITC in the US for someone who's unmarried with 2 children, and this is for 2012. So in this scheme, we see that the wage subsidy is $1.40, is 40%. Okay, so here we're saying that the wage under the program from A to B is 1.4 times the regular wage. Okay, so it's 40%. Okay, then when we get to point B, so when the person makes 13,090, they're getting the maximum amount of the credit. Okay, so they're getting this vertical distance in terms of the credit from the government, right? This is the 40% higher. So 40% or 1.4 times this amount would be the associated income level at the maximum of the program. But after point B, the person can work some more hours, and the government's not going to take any of that benefit back. Okay, so up to point D, you're fine, you're not going to lose any. But after point D, when you work additional hours, you're only going to keep 79% of your wage, 0.79 times the wage. So this is the negative income tax portion. And then the break-even point of this program is at point E. So if someone just, had certain preferences that are very flat and maximized here, for example, the program's irrelevant to them. But if they have steep indifference curves and they're in this area, then the program is going to affect their decision. Okay, so again, for earnings of $13,090 or less, they get a tax credit of 40%, or in other words, a wage subsidy. So that's one thing to point out with this program is it's the wage subsidy comes at the end of the year when they do their income taxes. So that's why it's an earned income tax credit. So, and it says right there, it's a tax credit. So that's going to be at the end of the year. So they're not going to see that on their paychecks. And so, that could potentially affect the incentives associated with this. But I think many people would realize that, okay, the money's going to be coming at the end of the year, and they would realize that the more they work, especially if they work in this range, they're going to be getting a very large tax return at the end of the year. So in this example, the maximum tax credit allowed for this single parent with 2 children was $5,236. Okay, so at point B here, when they reach this income, they're now getting the maximum credit, which is the difference between this and this, which is the $5,236. Okay, if they continue to work to the left, between point B and D, nothing is going to be taken away. That tax credit they still get to keep, so they still get to keep the $5,236. And they're just going to, their regular wage is what they're going to receive. But anything after D, this is the negative income tax, and so this is where the government starts clawing back some of the benefits. Their wage is going to be less than their market wage. So they're going to, if they go out and work to the left of D, they're going to get their paycheck, but at the end of the year, they're going to get less than whatever the wage is, because the government's going to take back some of that. Overall, though, again, they're still going to be at a higher income level than if they weren't part of the program and just worked on their own. So that's why this potential income constraint or budget constraint is above their old budget constraint, or the budget constraint without the program. But after point E to the left, doesn't matter if they're in the program. The program's irrelevant to them, because the amount, if they were to choose to work in this area, the income level would not qualify them for the program. Again, here the slopes are equal, and that's because they get to keep the benefit, and so their wage that they're going to get under the program is equal to their market wage. There's no clawback here, but after D, there is a clawback, and so their take-home wage is going to be less from D to E. It's useful to go over again the work incentive effects for the different ranges of this budget constraint. It's good to reinforce these ideas. If someone has preferences on the between A and B. So think of before the program, if someone's indifference curve is, say, here, and then all of a sudden they're able to enroll in this program, what's the effect on hours worked? Well, we know that that's just a wage subsidy, and so we know it's indeterminate. However, for many people, it's likely that the substitution effect would dominate the income effect because we're at very low levels of income here. Between B and D, well, that's just a pure income effect. So we know if someone was originally here, the program would reduce their hours worked. And if they're along the point DE, well, we know that that would also reduce hours worked because we have the substitution effect and income effect working in the same direction. So let's compare the work incentives of the EITC versus traditional welfare. So here's a traditional welfare illustration. So this person is going to maximize their utility by not working. They're going to take all of their discretionary time in the form of leisure. Okay, and remember, with a traditional program, there's 100% clawback. So the budget constraint would be horizontal here. So as the person works more and takes less leisure, their income is going to stay constant because the government is just going to take away from their benefit any amount that they made in the labor market. So clearly here, if there wasn't this welfare program, the person would maximize their utility by working some positive hours, but in the face of this welfare program, they decide not to work. So there's a strong disincentive to work. Now let's think about the EITC program. Everything else is the same, but we have an EITC program. So at first we have a wage subsidy and then a phase out. Well, clearly here, would the person still decide not to work? So if we had their budget constraint before any program being here, but now instead we have the EITC program, well, in order for this person to maximize their utility, they would want to go here, right? And so they would want to provide positive hours worked in the labor market. Okay, and they're actually getting more income too than in the traditional welfare program. Okay, let's do some practice questions. So consider the two budget lines in this diagram. And the question is, if the person's optimum number of hours worked is 7 hours, what must the wage be? Okay, well, if this person is working 7 hours, then they must be taking 24 minus 7 hours of leisure. So 24 minus 7 is 17. So they're optimizing here. So that tells us that they're at this point, and it tells us that they're on this budget constraint. So what's the wage associated with this budget constraint? Well, we know if the person worked all 24 hours, they would get $240. So that must be $10 per hour. 10 times 24 equals 240. And so the answer is A, $10. Now assume under an income maintenance program that the basic benefit or guarantee is $9,000. Okay, and now suppose that the benefit reduction rate is 50%. So that tells us this is a negative income tax scheme. Okay, so they're going to get a basic benefit of $9,000 per year. And if they work and make income, that's going to be taken back or clawed back from the government at 50%. Okay, so if a family has an earned income of $3,000 per year, what would its subsidy payment be? Okay, well, it's going to get, let's think about this. So the government would give them $9,000 if they weren't working at all. But then this person is deciding to work, and they're getting $3,000. So how much of that $3,000 is the government going to take away from them? Well, we're told they're going to take 50% of it. So they're going to take $1,500. So in that case, their subsidy payment, so the answer is B, $7,500. Next question. So Sally can work up to 3,120 hours each year. She has a busy social life, and sleep takes up the remaining time, her remaining time. She earns a fixed hourly wage of $25, and she owes a 10% payroll tax on the first $40,000 of income. Above $40,000 of income, there is no payroll tax. A payroll tax is simply a tax on your income, but it's taken off your paycheck. So an example of that would be employment insurance or Canada Pension Plan. Okay, so now we're also told that Sally faces a progressive income tax rate. Okay, so on the first $10,000 of income she makes, she doesn't pay any tax, it's zero. From $10,000 to $60,000, her marginal income tax is 25%. And then above $60,000, the marginal tax rate is 50%. Now the question is asking us to graph Sally's budget line. Okay, so all of our information is here. We have the wage is $25. The total discretionary time is 3,120 hours. The payroll tax is 10% on any income less than $40,000. She faces a progressive income tax scheme such as this. So the first $10,000, she doesn't pay any tax. Any income from $10,000 to $60,000, she pays 25%. And then anything above $60,000, she pays 50%. Okay, so I put these in columns, and let's start with if she were to take all of her time in leisure. So this 3,120 hours, if it's in leisure, she wouldn't work at all, okay? She wouldn't then pay any payroll tax. Her income would then just be in this case, it would be zero, because there's no there's no cash grant or anything like that. Her income tax would be zero, and her after-tax income would be the same as her before-tax income, which would be zero. As we go down, she's going to increase her work. If Sally decides to not work at all and take all of her discretionary time in the form of leisure, well, then she's not going to make any money, so her work hours will be zero. However, if she decides to work 120 hours, for example, she'll have 3,000 hours of leisure, 120 hours of work. Her before tax income is going to be 3,000. Okay, because she's going to work 120 hours at $25 per hour, but she has to pay a payroll tax. So the payroll tax will be 10% of this amount, so it'll be 300. And her income tax will be, in this case, zero, because she's making under 10,000, and her after-tax income will be 2,700. Okay, so we fill in all of the values from 320 to 0. And if we plot y after tax with leisure, so the first and the last column, we'll get her budget constraint. So if we do that, we will get this diagram right here. Okay, so this gray line here is just her $25 an hour wage, but with the payroll tax and progressive income tax, this line here represents her take-home pay. Okay, and we see that it changes slope in a couple of these different areas. And so that's what Sally's budget line would look like. Okay, let's look at another question. So currently the U.S. Department of Transportation has a rule that allows commercial truck drivers to drive up to 90 hours per week. After 40 hours per week, drivers' hourly pay goes up by 50%. Now there's a proposed rule that would reduce this limit to 60 hours per week. Assume truck drivers currently drive more than 60 hours per week. And ignoring the safety aspects of the proposed rule, let's use our model to analyze the likely effects of this new rule on the utility of truck drivers. And so we're going to use a graph to support our analysis. So the constraint created by this new law looks like the one below. From 0 to 40 hours, the truck drivers get paid their normal amount. Anything beyond 40, they're going to get 50% more pay. So there's the wage here, and then this is 1.5 times the wage. So we're going to assume that all truckers work more than 60 hours per week. So all of them would have preferences in this area here where they would maximize at a point that's tangent to the budget constraint to the left here of 60. Okay? So anyone with a utility maximizing point along this steep part here and above the horizontal line, this is where we have 60. So we're trying to see, are they going to be worse off or better off? Well, they're choosing to work more than 60 hours and getting this higher income. So now this new rule says you can't work more than 60 hours a week. Has to be lower, right? Clearly, their indifference curve. So any indifference curve here, if we're going to make them work a max, even if we say we're going to work the max at 60 hours, their indifference curve is going to be less. So this type of legislation would make truck drivers worse off in terms of their utility. Of course, it may be more safer for them, but that's not part of the question, and that's not part of their utility function in this example, and so it would make them worse off. So the new legislation wouldn't make them very happy. So another question, suppose a country passes a law that cuts the standard workday from 8 to 7 hours. Overtime hours worked per day beyond the standard workday in this country is paid at 50% above the normal wage rate. Please answer the following questions related to the work incentives facing workers in this country. Okay, so we're going to draw the old budget constraint showing the overtime premium after 8 hours of work per day. And we're also on our diagram going to draw the new budget constraint. And then we're going to use the diagrams in A and B to analyze the change in work incentives. Okay, so what does the budget constraint look like in this situation? So if someone starts working positive hours, their income goes up by the wage. Now, when the standard work week was 8 hours, the standard work day was 8 hours per day, we had that the slope increased here, which represented the overtime pay. Now this is being shifted to the right by 1 hour. So now the standard work week is 7, and it becomes steeper here now, earlier than before. So for those already working overtime, like this person would, there will be a pure income effect reducing overtime hours. For those working between 7 and 8 hours, basically they're facing a higher wage. So there's going to be a substitution and income effect working in the opposite direction. And for those that were working a bit less than 7 hours before, some will now work overtime, more overtime, as I indicated here, but others, if they have steeper indifference curves, their labor supply behavior could even be unaffected. Okay, we are at the end of the lecture. Thank you for listening. Next class, we're going to be talking about labor supply over the life cycle.